I met my stalker when I was in middle school. My school consisted of 7th grade through 12th grade and had a normal program and an accelerated program. The students within each program were pretty segregated from each other. My friends and I all belonged to the accelerated program, but there was one guy in the group from the normal program named Carson. We were all typical teenagers, with Carson being the group's prankster. We could only hang out at school, really, because we were all shipped in from various parts of the county for the accelerated program. After school, we would all get on AOL to chat and play games together. Online, we had even more friends, as we'd each invite our own local friends to chat with everyone. One day, Carson invited his friend Steve to join in. He was nice and contributed a lot to the conversation. We learned that Steve actually attended our school too, but he was in the normal program, and so had a different lunch period than the rest of us. We had almost no chance of crossing paths with each other. We insisted on meeting him in person, however, and scheduled for Steve to come to my locker to meet up with everyone before first period. The next morning, we waited, and Steve never came. My friend and I did have a short exchange with another kid though, Marco, which consisted of us telling him to go away. Marco had been Carson's satellite since the beginning of the year. Wherever Carson went, Marco would stand 10 to 15 feet away watching us all. We had tried to become friends with him, but he was simply too strange. He would do things like touch your face unexpectedly or try to sneak up behind you and bite you. He'd tell you he wanted to see you inside out. His list of strange behaviors was a mile long. A few days after Steve failed to come meet with us, it came to light that Steve was actually Marco, and the whole thing was one of Carson's pranks. Considering Marco had been a pleasant addition to the chat as Steve though, we gave him another chance to join the real group as well. Besides Carson though, I was the only person that really gave Marco a chance. He still did all the weird things he had always been doing, but now it was more apparent it was more of an act to get attention for being the weird guy than anything really malicious. Marco was being abused at home by his mom's boyfriend. He rarely saw his mother because she worked so damn much. Marco became the poster child for bad attention is still attention because of this. Still, my other friends wanted him out of the group. I repeatedly found myself arguing his case to let him stay. Once I caught an older student beating Marco up, a boy that lived on my street. Being much larger than either of us, he was literally picking Marco up and slamming him around while calling him a freak. Knowing the bully and his mother, I did what was my signature move at the time and kicked him in the balls while threatening to tell his mom on him about how he was treating me and my friends. I believe this was the catalyst for years of torment, as Marco instead became my satellite after that day. At school, Marco followed me any chance he got. At home, he would message me non-stop, typically in private chats, as my other friends no longer wanted anything to do with him. I felt a bit bad. He was a sweet kid besides his weird attention-seeking stunts, and no one should have to go through life with no friends. Eventually, Marco asked me out, which I politely declined. He was my friend, but he was not the type of guy I would ever be interested in dating. He was persistent though, begging me to give him a chance. Over and over again, I would have to tell him no. One day, his approach suddenly changed. "You will go out with me, or I'll show your mom all of our chat logs." There was nothing especially bad in there. I wasn't drinking or doing drugs or anything bad. I was pretty depressed at the time though, and sometimes talked about wanting to hurt myself. If my parents saw any of that, I could effectively kiss my freedom and privacy goodbye. I tried to bluff him, telling him good luck with any attempts to convince my parents to believe him over me. That actually seemed to work. I was not very impressed with the stunt either, and stopped talking to him soon after. A few weeks went by and Marco came crawling back begging for forgiveness. Eventually, I caved in, allowing him back into the group with me. At first, he was well behaved again, but he slowly started pestering me to be his girlfriend once more. Over the course of high school, he tried many different methods: begging, blackmailing, attacking my self-esteem by calling me ugly and a slut, catfishing me, threatening any guys I dated, and more. I tried to be nice at first, but eventually I had to get mean in how I said no. His behavior would always reach a boiling point that forced me to cut him out of our friend group. It was nearly impossible to actually get rid of him, however. Online, he would create dozens of new accounts to send messages from, overwhelming my attempts to block him. He would call my phone all night long and leave woeful messages about how lonely he was and how he would kill himself if I stopped being his friend. He would show up at my house and stand outside my bedroom window at random times. When my parents had parties like the 4th of July, Thanksgiving, or Halloween, he would always manage to find out and show up. Because these parties were always pretty big with an open-door policy, he'd slip in, usually in disguise. Then he'd do something to get thrown out, like get belligerently drunk or stuff his face with all the food, then slam them back down on the serving platters. The first time I really felt that Marco might be an actual threat, though, was at one of my parents' Halloween parties when we were 16. One of my dad's friends had a son our age named Tim. He was a bit of a joke and fancied himself pretty cool. He thought it would be fun to pick a fight with a weird kid, make a display of his superior strength. Marco accepted his challenge. We all knew he was going to get the crap beat out of him. Going out into the streets, Tim towered over Marco. That year, he was dressed as Alex from A Clockwork Orange, his favorite book, with his costume including a cane. He swung the cane at Tim, hitting him in the head with it. Tim went down quickly, and Marco beat him over and over until an adult intervened and sent him home. Marco's go-to threat became whenever I had a boyfriend. I'll beat him to death with a shovel and use it to bury his body. Suddenly, this threat seemed like something he was more than capable of. Our senior year of high school, Marco's dad died in prison. He learned the real reason his dad was put away was for murdering someone. He'd always thought his dad was in there for drugs, and he started to spiral out of control. He said that his dad was a murderer, so he must be doomed to be one too. He dropped out of school halfway through the year. My brother said that after I had left home for college, Marco came to the house looking for me a few times. Once he figured out I wasn't there, he'd come and stand in the front yard aimlessly, playing with a Bic lighter until someone threatened to call the police. One of my biggest fears was that he'd try to set our house on fire in some weird way of trying to punish me. When I'd go home with my boyfriend, he'd always show up at my parents' house. At one point, he even tried to intimidate my boyfriend into breaking up with me by showing him his big knife. It was always an ordeal to get him to leave. A lot of issues have now eased up just due to distance and time. I don't use social media much anymore, and I'm able to semi-block people on my phone. Initially, he was calling and texting every day. Hundreds and hundreds of messages. I tried asking him to stop, but this only encouraged him. My family no longer lives in that area, so I'm significantly less worried for their safety. I found the most successful way of dealing with him to be simply ignoring him. Eventually, his messages dwindled down to once a week, then once a month. Now I hear from him maybe officially once a year. His message is typically something along the lines of, "Please just be my friend. I won't try for anything more. I need you in my life." The last time I actually talked to him, which was about 4 to 5 years ago now, Marco tried to tell me I'd ruined his life. He said I put some spell on him and that he couldn't move forward with anything. He told me he would kill himself and it would be all my fault. I finally had to tell him I wouldn't care if he did. In fact, it would be quite the relief if he did so. His most recent MO is to call my work phone from a private number, just to hear me answer the phone, then hang up. He also calls and texts my brother, our high school friends, my brother's best friend, my parents, my grandparents, my aunt, and my husband, all to beg them to ask me to call him. He messaged my husband, "Tell her she's my angel, the love of my life. I'm nothing without her. I'm worried he'll snap someday and show up at my house or job and try to end me. I have security systems and other means of protection, but I'm still very paranoid about it. I've talked to the police about getting a restraining order, but they told me there's no real grounds unless he does start showing up and threatening to kill me. So I guess we'll see what happens." This story is not as shocking or traumatic as some of the ones you might have heard before, perhaps, but when it was happening to me, I was extremely upset and unnerved by it. This happened many years ago. I was newly single and looking for a way to meet new people, so I thought I would try my luck at online dating. I created a profile and went about speaking to some men online. I even met up for a few coffee dates or lunch. My initial nervousness at the prospect of meeting strangers online for possible romance was calmed down somewhat. I learned that there were actually quite a lot of nice guys out there just looking for the same companionship I was. I started to become more optimistic. In the past, I had this habit of dating men that were non-commitment types. I realized that I was ready to try and find somebody that wanted something a little more serious. I made a big mistake, though. In formulating this goal, I had largely blamed myself for my failed past relationships, reasoning that perhaps I had somehow unconsciously chosen a partner who was not ready for commitment. I decided I should try and be more open to nice, sincere men who seemed ready for the kind of relationship I was ready for. In doing so, I ended up ignoring the gut instincts I had always followed, and that came back to bite me. This is where Mark enters the scene. Mark worked in banking and was divorced with one child. He was fairly good-looking, articulate, and we shared many interests. We began chatting online. This progressed to phone calls after a couple of days, and finally the idea arose to meet for coffee. Looking back, I now note that he seemed in a hurry to meet me right from the get-go, despite me saying I preferred to speak for a while initially. We decided on a possible date, general location, and general time, but nothing was truly confirmed. I recall at the time I was actually fairly busy, and as we began to get closer to the date, I felt like I was going to be too busy to meet up with anyone. In the days leading up, without a location or exact time set, I didn't get back to him. I ended up getting tied up with other things and didn't know when I'd be free. I hadn't spoken to him in several days by this point. This is where the first red flag occurred, and in retrospect, I should have passed altogether on further meeting. As I said though, I was trying out this new attitude of being more open and accepting of nice men. On the date we'd discussed meeting initially, I was out somewhere doing something when my phone rang. I noticed it was Mark. I picked it up and he spoke to me in a warm tone. "Hey, I'm in your neighborhood. I know we said we were going to meet today, but where would you like to meet me? 'Cause I'm here right now waiting." I found this alarming because not only had I never gotten back to him with a time or location, I knew for a fact he lived 2 cities away, and it would have taken a lot of time to drive down on the loose plan of a meeting that had never been confirmed. Again, I told myself, this man must really want to meet you. That shows he's sincere, I guess. Enjoy this for a change. Against my gut instinct, I told him I would simply meet him on a different day, and we agreed on a concrete date and time instead. When the date arrived, it went surprisingly well. He was just as good looking in real life. We had good conversations and he was very nice. We started seeing each other. He was all about romantic gestures, paying attention to me, calling me, generally just being kind and sweet every day. He always seemed to want to spend time with me, and I told myself that this is what I had been missing for a long time. I tried my best to appreciate the gestures and attention as something positive, even though I wasn't really used to this much. It did feel a little strange as well, because I didn't know him that well. He would do things like show up unannounced with flowers to my work, only a short time after meeting each other in person. He was very touchy and feely, something I wasn't used to, and he did it in an off-putting way. I was uncomfortable with his constant touching and rubbing of me all over the place, generally suffocating me with his presence even while we were in public. I recall one time telling him that I was going downtown with a group of girlfriends for a birthday celebration, and he insisted we should go out for a drink alone beforehand. I said that was not really necessary because I only had an hour or so to spend prior to going out with them. The drive for him to get there was already an hour or more. This would be an extreme amount of trouble to go through just to see me for a short period of time, but he insisted that even a single hour would be worth it. When he arrived, I met him at a local pub. We had a drink, and then he laughed and joked that he should just come downtown with me and my girlfriends. I told him no, that was really weird. He wasn't invited, and that was not what we had discussed. He went home dejected, and that was the first time I felt a little bit off about him. Things went on though, and I spent the night at his house after about 3 weeks. I told him I had plans the next day, and I would have to get going at about 10 a.m. or so. When I went to leave the next morning though, he got very distressed and kept insisting I should stay because it was such a beautiful day. It was such a real shame I was leaving because there were so many wonderful things we should do together. He blocked me in. I should also mention that for the past week or so, he'd been insisting he loved me and would tell me multiple times a day. I didn't reciprocate because I wasn't ready for that yet. When I went to leave out the front door, he wrapped himself in front of me in the doorway and kissed me over and over, repeating the words, "I love you, you're everything I want in a woman," like a robot. I got really grossed out at the way he was behaving. I shoved him out of the way and left very irritated, although I didn't say anything, as I really did need to get going. I decided before I was even out of his driveway that I was never going to meet up with him again. Over the next day or two, I thought about how I would let him down and talked it over with my friends. I kicked myself too for deliberately ignoring my gut. During this time, I responded to his relentless phone calls with polite texts to stall him until I was ready to come up with a response. Finally, I settled on what I felt was a compassionate but firm approach to letting him down. I spoke to him on the phone and explained I had come to the conclusion that I was not at a point in my life where I wanted this relationship whatsoever, with anyone, including him. That was a lie, of course, but I didn't want to hurt his feelings. He kept trying to question what he had gotten wrong, what he'd misunderstood, but I just kept repeating that nothing was wrong. I simply didn't want to date. I went with this approach out of a complete lack of interest in doing anything to enlighten him what a turn-off his behavior was. I already had enough responsibility in my life. I had no desire to add him to it. Since we'd only been seeing each other less than a month, I thought that would be the end of it. But boy, was I wrong. I woke the following day to find a long, desperate email in my inbox. Basically, he said he was mentally ill. He was taking antidepressants that he blamed for his clingy behavior, although I had not complained to him about this at all. He ended by saying he would throw out all his medication, and therefore we should date again. The tone of the letter was very panicked and weird. I ignored it. Then the real onslaught began. Over the following weeks or so, he blew up my work phone, cell phone, and email with non-stop messages. I became increasingly annoyed at how entitled he felt to dismiss everything I said and to blatantly intrude in my life with such a relentless stream of calls and emails. At work, for example, he called my desk phone 34 times in a 3-hour period. My coworkers were flabbergasted and even offered to answer and scream in his ear. I cannot understand why he thought this behavior would somehow make me like him, but obviously it did the exact opposite. He even began to use attempts like regarding a pair of cheap plastic scratch sunglasses he left in his car. He claimed they were very expensive and were heirlooms from his mother, and she would be very upset if I didn't return them to him. Whatever. I drove to his house and dumped them in his mailbox. I finally texted him back after this to say, "They're in your mailbox. Don't contact me again." Of course, that didn't stop him though. The onslaught continued for days on end. He'd always exclaimed that I'd left something small, like a scarf or something at his house, and that he needed to return it to me. I'd send him another text. "I told you to stop harassing me. If you contact me again, I'm calling the cops." Eventually, this did work. Well, sort of. I continued to get Facebook messages from him for years after, even though we were not friends. I never responded to a single one. In the last one, he told me he was following me out in public somewhere. I was with my giant husband at the time, thank God. He wrote how good I looked, and added that he hoped still that we could be friends again one day. No thanks, Mark. I do not want to be your friend. But thanks for the lesson you taught me. Never ignore your instincts. Listening to mine led me to the next awesome, sincere, and unclingy man that I ended up marrying. It started during Christmas break last year. A close friend of mine had an appointment for a pretty detailed tattoo, so she wanted me to come along with the boyfriend she had at the time, and his best friend Chuck. Now, mind you, I had never once met this Chuck before, but he's the main star of our story here. My friend and I were supposed to meet up with Chuck at Dunkin' Donuts before the appointment, since he was also supposed to be getting a tattoo done. When he arrived, he wasn't at all who I expected him to be. He seemed pretty cool at first. Then though, he started acting like one of those fake deep people who thinks they know everything about someone by looking into their eyes. He kept telling me he really liked that he could see I was a person who suffered like he has, and at one point he even said, "Your eyes are like a vortex." Needless to say, it kinda weirded me out. I figured it wouldn't be that big a deal though. Since the whole purpose of meeting up was to get some tattoos, we started talking about that instead. I showed him the tattoos I already had and what other ones I had planned. For some reason, Chuck insisted that he buy a small, relatively cheap tattoo for me. I kept on trying to say no, on behalf of the fact that I just met him an hour ago. But he kept insisting it was no big deal. As weird as it made me feel, I decided to simply go with it. No use in arguing. Fast forward to the appointment. We're sitting there in the parlor's lobby, waiting for the artist to be done with their current client. All of a sudden, Chuck starts acting weird. He's saying he's having an anxiety attack. Obviously, I don't take that lightly, but I was confused as to what was happening. Regardless of how odd it seemed though, we tried to calm him down. While my friend was getting her large thigh piece done, I got the tattoo Chuck had offered to pay for. It was just a short quote on my arm, and only took about 10 minutes. After this, Chuck got his small hand tattoos done. This is when he decided he wanted to get one to commemorate our meeting. I was really unsure about this. It was so weird. He was married, and I wasn't sure if his wife was a jealous person. Either way, it didn't seem very appropriate. He kept on saying, though, that I was a cool-ass chick who was spontaneous like him. I can't remember exactly why, but the talk of my initials came up. He really liked that my initials were SSS. So this man, who I'd met just 2 hours before, decided to get that tattooed on the front of his wrist. I was very uncomfortable now. I wasn't sure what to do. My friend and her at-the-time boyfriend were too occupied doing their own things to say much, so I just kind of zoned out and went with it. After that was over, we all parted ways, and he told me he was going to start texting me. I thought he meant he would text me like 1 or twice after and disappear, but surprisingly, he tried to talk to me a whole lot. He was actually kind of a nuisance. I replied to him anyway though, because I liked that he took me seriously, and I was insecure in that period of time. Things got more and more weird though. He would constantly ask me if I wanted to go and watch movies with him and his wife. At one point, we ended up talking about my sexuality. He told me it was so cool with him because his wife was also bisexual. He kept on saying his wife wanted to meet me. It was getting more and more suggestive. As time went on, I started replying less because I was pretty sure he had some sort of weird fetish going on with me. And that's when shit hit the fan. One night, Chuck was drunk. He was actually pretending and decided to profess his love for me. He said he'd fallen in love with me the second he met me and was so overwhelmed with the feeling it caused him to have the anxiety attack I mentioned earlier. Of course, he was married and I had no interest in him. I had never once led him on or even suggested I liked him. I hadn't even talked to him that much. He told me his marriage was falling apart. I texted the friend from earlier in the story, and she told me he was lying about everything. The next day while I'm in class, he texts me and told me he lied about everything himself. As you can imagine, I was livid. How fucked up was it to lie to me about things like that, especially saying his wife was cheating on him and stuff? He tried to tell me he'd never do anything like that again, but I wasn't having it. I'll admit I said some pretty brutal things to him, but it was well deserved. I decided my best decision was to block him. Afterwards, my friend would text me all the time, saying Chuck was harassing her to try to get through to me. At this point, both of us were done with his shit. He was causing a lot of issues. Even a few months after the incident, her boyfriend cut him off too, because he was starting to harass him as well. Even though it was nearly a year ago, I still wonder how he feels when he looks down at his wrist and sees my initials there.